Thank you for joining us for part 2 of our webinar series to launch the Nautilus 2024 General Election Manifesto. My name is Helen Kelly and I'm the Director of Communications, Campaigns and Digital here at Nautilus International, and I will be chairing this webinar today. Part 1 was on Tuesday when General Secretary Mark Dickinson outlined the background to the manifesto and gave a presentation on future-proofing skills and training. I encourage those of you who missed it to catch up on this webinar via our YouTube channel, and we've put a link to that in the Q&A box. You should be able to see that on the right-hand side of your screens. You can also download a copy of the manifesto from that Q&A box as well. And of course, we're also recording today's webinar, so if you do have any colleagues that you feel could benefit from watching, please forward them the link from our YouTube channel and subscribe to ensure that you don't miss out on any other content in future. There will be plenty of time to ask questions of our presenters today. Please put these into the Q&A panel, and if you can't see that on your screens already, you should be able to find an icon on the top and the center, the middle of your screen. So today's webinar will focus on 3 key topics. We'll be looking at full protections for maritime employment, growing our industry domestically and internationally, and ensuring UK leadership internationally on social and employment rights. To talk you through these key asks, I'm pleased to introduce to you Nautilus Director of Organising, Martin Gray. Martin was previously an engineer with Maersk before working for Nautilus. First as an organizer, then executive officer for strategy, policy and governance, and now as director of organizing. Martin is also a trustee of the Seafarers Charity and the Maritime Education Foundation. So welcome, and over to you, Martin.
Thank you, Helen. So, colleagues, thank you for joining us again today. And let me start with section 2 of our manifesto, which is full protection for maritime employment. Now, the 17th of March 2022 was truly a pivotal moment in our industry. It was the day a once renowned British brand, P&O Ferries, without any consultation or notice, sacked almost their entire UK resident workforce. Now, P&O Ferries, put simply, shone a spotlight onto the many vulnerabilities and injustices faced by UK resident seafarers, with the race to the bottom in terms of conditions for UK seafarers not beginning with P&O Ferries, and P&O Ferries' actions of the 17th of March were not an isolated incident, but rather a symptom of a broader systemic problem. And that problem will continue unless we take steps to turn the tide. Now, this requires us to understand what allowed P&O Ferries to act in such a heinous way. And frankly, colleagues, it's the employment legislation in the UK, and that aided and abetted P&O Ferries' actions. Now, P&O Ferries looked carefully at the Trade Union Labour Relations Consolidation Act of 1992 and still decided that they could carry out the mass sackings in the shocking way that they did. The legislation, rather than protecting seafarers as employers, aided and abetted and supported P&O Ferries' actions. And that's why we need to amend the Trade Union Labour Relations Consolidation Act 1992. It's to close the loopholes that currently allow companies to bypass obligations to consult workers, amend the Act to ensure that employers are compelled to consult and notify all relevant authorities, which includes both flag and port states, ahead of any such actions. And additionally, we crucially need to introduce injunctive relief to provide affected workers and the representatives like Nautilus with the power to challenge unjust decisions in real time as those unjust decisions are happening. Furthermore, the practice of fire and rehire must be outlawed. Since P&O Ferries, Nautilus has had first-hand experience of 2 further companies threatening this practice, and thankfully both companies backed down after pressure from Nautilus and from our members. But this coercive tactic, cynically deployed to unilaterally weaken employees' terms and conditions, has no place in industrial relations, and it should never be an option and must be outlawed. Now, March of 2023, the UK government introduced a voluntary Seafarers Charter as part of efforts to prevent another P&O ferry scandal. However, it lacks enforcement. It lacks any enforcement needed for it to make a real difference. Ferry operators would face no penalties for non-compliance, and many of the obligations that the Seafarers Welfare Charter reiterates are based in existing international standards. Now, making the Charter mandatory, as is supported by the Labour Party and other political parties and the Cross-Party Transport Select Committee, enhance its provisions, and particularly regarding pay and rostering patterns, we can ensure better employment standards across the ferry sector. The French government has already taken such steps and has been effective since June, since this month of 2024, after legislation was passed 3 months ago. It is high time that we follow suit. And as many of you on this call will be aware, your contracts are often held through holding companies in jurisdictions like Guernsey, Jersey, Singapore, and this often denies you the same statutory employment rights as shore-based employees in the UK. And the practice allows companies to avoid paying UK employer liabilities whilst also limiting workers' legal recourse. So we're calling on the incumbent government to end this and other exploitative practices, to ensure contracts of employment are subject to UK law and jurisdiction, to ensure that UK resident seafarers can access full UK employment rights and social protections. And whilst protecting and enhancing the rights of maritime professionals is critical, it's also important that the UK restores its maritime heritage and pride by working to ensure good maritime jobs are being created. And this requires support from government. So that's why we're also calling on the next government to implement a favourable procurement system for UK flag vessels, with UK resident crew employed in strategic areas such as offshore renewable energy projects and strategic national defence. The offshore renewable energy sector in particular will continue to grow as we strive towards energy independence and net zero and decarbonisation of the maritime and wider UK economies. As the offshore renewable sector grows, it must be defined by good jobs, good working conditions. It cannot follow the path of other sectors that are defined by flags of convenience and exploitative labour practices. And unfortunately, we've already seen these practices with the so-called offshore wind workers concession, a visa concession that allowed companies in the installation of offshore wind farms to bypass usual immigration rules, to bring crew from abroad, often on weaker terms and conditions compared to UK crews. It was initially a temporary measure introduced in 2017 to make up for an apparent and purported lack of skill and experience in the UK domestic market. But the concession was extended 6 times, and after campaigning work from Nautilus and others, it was eventually ended last year. But there is much more to do, and we need a government committed to UK seafarers. That's why we will push the next government to favour companies in public procurement processes that are committed to supporting UK jobs and the UK flag and ship register. By doing so, we provide high quality job opportunities for UK seafarers, particularly those transitioning from the oil and gas and offshore industries, and we crucially support the regeneration of our coastal communities. Additionally, we need concrete action plan to support the growth of the UK flag. The UK government's post-P&O ferries commitment to this goal was commendable, but never materialised. A robust action plan is essential to reverse the decline of the UK flag, a matter of national security given our reliance on maritime trade. With investment in the UK ship register and the training and employment of UK crew, it should be seen as a strategic priority, and it's essential for securing our supply chains in times of global instability. Furthermore, the Merchant Shipping Act of 1995 requires a comprehensive review and modernisation. This legislation must evolve to support the growth of the UK flag and the training and employment of local labour. It must recognise UK seafarers as key workers, ensuring their social and employment rights are maintained. even during global health crises, are vital steps towards creating a resilient and equitable maritime industry. Now, if the next government is committed to supporting the domestic shipping industry, then we must have a proper conversation about the benefits of cabotage. The UK is one of the few maritime nations without such laws, leaving our domestic industry vulnerable to unfair and unequal competition. A full review of cabotage would extend the Seafarers Wages Act beyond its current limitations and apply a mandatory seafarers welfare charter to all vessels engaged in UK cabotage. This would support the growth of new sectors, such as offshore renewables, and provide training and job opportunities across coastal communities too. The maritime industry, the central nervous system of the global economy, operates across borders, and international cooperation is crucial. It's critical that we continue to play a leading role in advocating for the social and employment rights of seafarers. Reflecting on the pandemic, the UK was a forerunner in recognising seafarers as key workers. Now, we must build on this momentum by pushing for continuous improvements in the ILO Maritime Labour Convention, ensuring it remains a living document that extends the social and employment rights of seafarers globally. We must level up and raise the floor. The next ILO Special Tripartite Committee for the MLC meets in April 2025. This group brings together seafarers, trade unions, ship owners, and national governments to agree changes to the Maritime Labour Convention. And we believe that further changes to the MLC are needed to build on the progress on areas like connectivity, personal protective equipment, and simple things such as access to clean drinking water. We also want to see the next UK government support our calls for the MLC to be amended, so ship owners' responsibility to repatriate seafarers at the end of their contracts is extended to the point at which seafarers land at their home location. The MLC was never designed to be a static document, nor was it conceived to set a ceiling on the rights of seafarers. It was designed to set a floor that would continually rise. It is crucial that the next government understands this. We also call on the UK to ratify ILO 185 on Seafarers Identity Documents Convention as revised in 2003. This convention creates a framework for the standardisation of seafarer identity documents. This would benefit seafarers by facilitating easier access to foreign ports, easing transit through countries to join vessels. It also supports seafarers with access to shore leave and repatriation. And such measures are essential for supporting the well-being of seafarers, particularly in times of crises. Now, addressing the pervasive issue of flags of convenience is another priority. These flags, as set out by the ITF Fair Practices Committee, are characterised by low wages and poor working conditions, undermining international labour standards. Looking at Liberia, Panama and the Marshall Islands, 3 countries with a combined population of less than 10 million people represent nearly half of the world's fleet of merchant ships. Again, reflecting on the COVID-19 pandemic, it exposed many issues across our economy, but it also highlighted the out of sight, out of mind nature of our industry. The pandemic starkly highlighted the vulnerabilities of global ship registration system, with many seafarers stranded at sea without access to basic rights. Country after country entered lockdown, with tens of thousands of seafarers being left stranded, denied repatriation and denied transit. Nautilus was aware of severe cases of seafarers being denied shoreside medical assistance, and we're even aware of seafarers who died on board with their bodies denied repatriation and having to be kept in the ship's cold storage. We had cadets stuck on board training vessels for 9-10 months at a time, anchored off the coast, not going anywhere, not able to undertake studies, not able to return home, not able to further learn the tools of their trade needed. All of this combined makes us see that the facts are quite simple. FOC states with ultimate responsibility for enforcing and guaranteeing fundamental rights of seafarers were nowhere to be seen when these rights required enforcing the most. They lacked the means to exercise effective control over vessels on their ship registers, and they ignored the major port states who also locked out shipping. As I mentioned before, we have to learn lessons from the pandemic, and the lesson here is really clear. The FOC system, so ingrained in our industry, is not fit for purpose. Therefore, the UK, alongside like-minded countries, must push for a global review of ship registration practices to enforce Articles 91 and 94 of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And that requires a genuine link between the vessel and country of registration and ensuring effective control of ships. Lastly, we believe the UK government should review its support for the Red Ensign Group, a group which contains several flag of convenience states. The group represents unfair competition to the UK ship register, and often prioritising the growth of the UK ship register over competing flags of convenience within the group. It's going to be crucial for fostering a strong domestic maritime industry that will lead to strong employment and employment standards. So, colleagues, turning the tide on decline, exploitation, and unfair treatment of seafarers requires many key reforms, as laid out in our manifesto. But by implementing these measures, we can ensure full protections for maritime employment, strengthen our domestic industry, and position the UK as a global leader in advocating for the rights and welfare of seafarers. Together, we can create a maritime sector that is fair, resilient, and aligned with the values of a 21st century Britain. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Martin. There was quite a lot there, and I'm sure it will raise, a few questions from our participants. So just a reminder, colleagues, please do put those questions in the Q&A section that I can put them to our participants shortly. Before we get there, though, I'd like to bring in my colleague, Robert Murtagh. He's our communications and campaigns organizer, and he's going to give us a brief update on the outreach that we're doing on the manifesto during this election period. So, hi, Robert, and over to you, please.
Hello. Thank you, Helen, and thank you for that, Martin. I think Martin laid out some of the key reforms as Mark did on Tuesday on skills and training as well. I think it's really, really important that, we have a manifesto, we have our policies, but there's no point in having a manifesto and a document if we're not going to do anything about it. And so what we have created is we don't expect, we're going to send the manifesto out to candidates across the UK, particularly within coastal communities and in in constituencies with high levels of Nautilus members. But what we're actually asking them to do, we're not asking the candidates to sign up to every single policy. There's a lot there. What we're asking them to do, what we've done is sort of break down the key policies that are contained in the manifesto into a couple of key principles, and we're asking candidates to support some of these key principles. So what we've created is our maritime worker pledge, which, as I say, is sort of trying to summarize our manifesto into those 5 points: to prevent another P&O ferry scandal, to support good jobs, fair pay and decent conditions, to support a maritime just transition, to enhance seafarer rights internationally, and to tackle the issue of flags of convenience. So this is the outreach that we'll be doing at this point in the run-up to the 4th of July. And of course, after the 4th of July, when we do know what the next government looks like and who those MPs are, we will be reaching out again. We'll be trying to speak to them early on to get our issues onto the agenda and speak to them. But at this point, this is very much, we're asking candidates to take this pledge, to pledge their support for maritime workers on these 5 principles. And if you want to reach out to your candidates in your local area, then please do message me or email me. I'll put my email in the Q&A. It's campaigns@nautilusint.org. If you have any questions, just to reiterate, we are a non-party political union. We don't take any stance in the run-up to the election. We are asking candidates across the board to support our pledge, and I think that's absolutely the right thing to do. And what we would ask is, if you do reach out to candidates, as far as possible, that you reach out to all the candidates. There are certain limitations in terms of the Electoral Commission. We just want to make sure that all candidates are given the opportunity to pledge their support. But if you want, we have an email that I can send to you if you would like to reach out to MPs. I can send you this pledge card as well. And yeah, if you're interested, if you want to reach out, please do get in touch, and I'm more than happy to help. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Yes, we would like to reiterate that as well. We're non-party affiliated trade unions, so we are not campaigning on behalf of any of the current parties. We do lobby all candidates, and we would highly encourage all of our members to do the same, because we don't know what the makeup of the new government is going to be, and we want to make sure that there is as much awareness of the maritime industry and our key support for members of any of the MPs who end up sitting in the new government, and shadow ministers as well. So if you do want to take part in some of that work, get in contact with Robert, campaigns@nautilusint.org, and he can help you out. But now I'm really pleased to say that we've got time for putting some questions to Martin. You can also put some questions to Robert as well if you want to ask anything practical. A reminder, you can put your questions into the Q&A section in the Teams channel here. We don't have the capability to take voice questions or video questions, so do make sure that you put your questions in the Q&A, and I'll get those to Martin. I will take the liberty, though, Martin, of asking you the first one, if that's okay. So you mentioned there P&O Ferries mass sackings of its crew in 2022, and that really was a defining moment for our nation's industry. What do you think the key lessons there are to learn from that event?
There are a number of lessons. We learned that legislation that protects seafarers' employment in the UK isn't good enough. It just does not do the job. We learned that the UK government at the time was not willing to act quickly enough or deeply enough to meaningfully be able to reverse any decision that was made from the company in terms of interventions. And we learned that there is no relief for unions or representatives of employees to be able to intervene to stop a company doing something that is effectively a criminal act, that is downright wrong. Whether that be morally or otherwise, there's no mechanism where we're able to seek injunctive relief, we're able to seek a pause, we're able to force a company to engage as it should engage in doing so. So what we've learned is we need to reform the Trade Union and Labour Relations Act. We need to inform other elements of employment legislation to ensure that not only seafarers, but more widely, UK employment is fit for purpose, and it maintains a balance of relationship between employment rights for individuals who are workers, and that maintains that companies have to play fair when it comes to dealing with changes to employment conditions. And it should be a consultative process. There should be a negotiation involved, and they should not be able to act unilaterally.
No, absolutely. And when those employees do act in that way, then obviously we're more than happy to negotiate with them and to, support our members throughout those discussions. But that's what we're really asking for, isn't it? For employers to play fair and to, do the right thing by their employees.
Yeah, it's hardly groundbreaking stuff to ask for an employer to engage with its employees and its employee representatives. in terms of dealing with difficult times and changes. And P&O Ferries throughout COVID engaged with Nautilus and other recognised trade unions when discussing changes to working arrangements and working through an unfortunate redundancy period in May of 2020, as well as then later on in the November of 2020. So they had worked with us and other unions before on delivering changes that were able to support the business. So their excuses for not wishing to work with us on this basis simply don't wash. They didn't want the hassle of having to face us scrutinising their plans and saying they're not workable, which is what happened in previous consultations with them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Look, Martin, we've got a question coming through from Alan Dixon, and Alan, it's a really interesting question. It is slightly going back to the skills and training question that we talked about in the first webinar, but Martin, I'm sure you're going to be able to handle this just fine. So, Alan is talking about an article he read just yesterday that purports that the DFT is going to provide training to Ukrainians for their officer cadet program. His question really is, and I'm appending it, Alan, everyone else can read it in the Q&A. He's kind of asking, if we can support Ukrainian cadets, why can't the DFT commit to 100% smart funding for UK cadets as well?
That is a great question. And one I would like to know the answer to as well. So in terms of the Maritime Skills Commission, which has been ongoing in terms of exploring how maritime training is undertaken, the skills that's needed both now and for the future, and in terms of Maritime 2050, the government's overarching maritime strategy, the current outgoing government's maritime strategy, as I probably should put it, there are recommendations in there which are support for fully funding of both smart and cadet and maritime training. And there are huge benefits to support maritime training. For every £1 that's invested in maritime training, it tends to return over £4 back in terms of benefit and GVAs, a gross value add, to the UK economy. It is a genuine investment that pays for itself and then some. So it is a great question as to why the government can't fully fund for UK resident cadets, and one we are yet to get the answer for when both the experts in the Maritime Skills Commission, the parliamentary scrutiny that Maritime 2050 went through with its select committee review for the Transport Select Committee, and with our own research and support, all indicates independently and together that the best way to get gross value add, to upskill, to reskill, to make sure that there is a seafaring base in the UK is to fully support the training environment. So I don't think I can answer that question, but I think I've given enough to answer the question.
No, absolutely. And it's also not that much money that would be required, is it? Not that much extra money. Correct me if I'm wrong here, Martin, but they're currently spending about 15 million a year. So we'd be looking at doubling that to 30 million.
So it's about 15 million a year on smart funding. Full support for maritime training for the skills and stuff needed for the future be somewhere between 30 and 40 million
per year.
Per year. There would be savings, however, in taking up some of the other recommendations from the Maritime Skills Commission, such as centralisation, a national maritime training organisation that would administer maritime training in the UK, which would remove some of the cadet training providers and companies set up that support businesses to operate within tonnage tax and within smart funding. It would facilitate one centralised organisation where that would generate savings by having lower cost base, because there's a lot of repetition in the maritime training space amongst the training providers and how that they seek to operate. So there are savings and other ways of operating maritime training where that cost would be about 30 million a year in current figures to deliver this and deliver all of those recommendations to a good quality level that would train what we need now and what we need for the future.
Yeah, and dare I dare I say it, that's just a drop in the ocean, really, isn't it, in terms of budgets for a new government that will be formed very shortly. So definitely a key ask in our manifesto for that nationalised training provider. Look, I've got another question here for you, Martin. This one is around our ideas for a mandatory seafarers charter. You did mention that in your presentation. Could you perhaps give us a little bit more detail about what that might include and how it might be delivered?
So, mandatory seafarers charter is about actually putting some bite into what has already been proposed by again, really difficult to think of how to refer to the current outgoing government sort of in the election period. But the current proposals and plan that's been put forward allows for a voluntary charter to be set up where it guarantees employment standards, it talks about overtime, talks about safe rostering patterns. We're absolutely committed to all of those ideas, but we believe that they should be mandatory, that these things should be embedded legislatively to make sure that safe rostering patterns are what can be expected on board vessels, to make sure that these are encapsulated with research base. So it strengthens where the current proposals need strengthening in terms of actually overtime, in terms of entitlements, in terms of what safe rostering looks like, and makes them backed up by law for there to actually be consequences for where they're not met, for where these vessels are operating outside of that. So when it comes to seafarer welfare, it would guarantee above the Maritime Labour Convention what is expected for those that are operating vessels in particular in and around the UK coast.
Yeah, so in effect, we're asking for more than minimum levels to be, kind of enshrined within a mandatory piece of legislation. But I think it's also important to say that one of the key things that we're looking for as well is collective bargaining agreements, right? The enshrining of those. So I know for some members who are already working for employers who've got those CBAs, there may be some concern that a mandatory seafarers charter might disrupt some of the agreements or some of the things that they've come to agree with their employer and with the union. That's not the case, is it? If they've already got a CBA, then that agreement will be honoured.
Absolutely. So with collective bargaining and with a mandatory charter, the mandatory charter element would set and establish a floor. It would be a floor that we would look at having raised in increments similar to the principles which should underpin the Maritime Labour Convention. There should be an ever increasing, we should be looking to consistently uplift and raise and improve and get better from the way labour standards currently are to the future, where they should be significantly better in terms of equity and equality of treatment, and in terms of pay and conditions, workload, rostering, all really important critical elements. Collective bargaining would still be necessary in companies that are already well above where that floor sits and are committed to consistently remaining above that floor. There are a number of companies that immediately signed up to the welfare charter because they themselves know that they already meet and exceed the standards within. 4 companies straight off the bat on the launch of the charter last year were very happy to put their names to it and sign up immediately because they knew that they would have no difficulty in meeting the bare minimum standards that the government still thought fit to make as a voluntary requirement. So there are a number in industry that want to see a level playing field, that don't want to compete on the basis of exploitative practices allowing for greater profitability, but want to compete on the basis of quality, want to compete on the basis of fair competition, and want to compete on the basis of improving social responsibility and workers' rights and doing things with a mentality that improves the environment, social and governance aspects of the work that they're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'd be more than happy to continue working with those employers as well, of course. But moving on to the thorny issue of flags of convenience, and you mentioned in your presentation that these are pervasive across the industry, of course, but realistically, what can be done to mitigate against their impact?
Genuine enforcement of UNCLOS. Articles 91, 94, effective control and effective regulation and links between nation state and between vessel. So actually looking at the way the systems allow, looking at the flags of convenience, or the more acceptable terminology in the shipping industry of open registers that allow for shell companies in jurisdictions to be set up that hold the assets of the vessel, so that they can say, oh, there is a link there, even though no effective control is undertaken by that shell company, and it's merely just to hold the value of a vessel on the books so that they can seek to demonstrate that. Really getting into the nuts and bolts of the mechanics of how shipping is allowed to work, to operate to the lowest jurisdiction of inconvenience for the owner, and to really look at making sure that flags compete on the basis of quality, of genuine links, of working in a way that regulations are established and being supportive. So it's not curtailing international and global trade, but it's supporting and delivering a fair and equitable registration system, a mechanism of making sure that those links are genuine, aren't just set up for the opportunity to be able to operate under a jurisdiction where the legislative burden is somewhat less, where the employment protections for seafarers are somewhat less, where abandonments are somewhat easier for a ship owner to do, where it's inconvenient to do the right thing by its crew. And it's about making sure that those barriers that are in place that allow for certain legal fictions and corporate veils to exist are fully explored and removed, so that at the heart of it, there are genuine links. At the heart of it, there are nation states that are capable of enforcing the laws that are upon these vessels, so that when times are tough, such as across the COVID pandemic and such as across other soon to come geopolitical instabilities, there can be support that's needed for ship owners. Because I think that's one thing ship owners have realised. Actually, during COVID, one of the big issues with the flags of convenience were the complete lack of support that these flag states were able to provide owners operating underneath that, whereas it was a very different approach with national registers being involved.
No, absolutely. And we saw the UK and the Netherlands were two of the first countries to give seafarers their key worker status, weren't they, when the crew change crisis hit? And that certainly helped us support some of our members when they were stuck at sea or stuck at home. So, and that's, probably one of the least pointy examples I can give in terms of that times. But we do have another question coming in, and it is related to flags of convenience. It's around the Red Ensign Group. It's from Alan again. He says the Red Ensign Group does seem to trade on the back of the UK. Given that the UK does support the group, is there not levers that the UK can use to raise the standard of the flags in the group? Interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting, and there are there's direct control and there's influence. So there are levels of influence that are potentially available to the UK government to work with the rest of the Red Ensign Group, where standards are somewhat lower, where there are no incorporations of genuine links between vessel management, vessel ownership, and country of registration, where that can be worked at and linked with that. But there's also a lot of political sensitivities around that, as in terms of vessel registration for some of the Red Ensign Group countries amounts to a not insignificant amount of revenue income for the local governments. So there needs to be broader considerations given towards why these registers are being supported and how they're allowed to be supported, and also where the levers of influence are to really sort of step up in the legislative requirements where they are not as stringent as what the UK ship registers are, and to sort of set it up as an example of what can be done. And it's not unusual in terms of Red Ensign Group for other nations to have both national registers and international registers, where they have a national flag followed by an international registry, a secondary registry, as it were, that is a lot less stringent and covers a lot less of the legislation that's covered in the primary flag. Germany, France, Denmark, all examples of nations where they have both a primary domestic register and an international register that allows for slightly different things to be done with that. But there's a way of doing that in a sustainable way that protects the rights of seafarers, that protects the ability for owners and operators to be supported in times of crisis and in times of need, as well as still being effective and competitive on a global stage for the costs involved in ship registration and ship ownership.
Absolutely. And thanks, Alan, for that question. Just to remind everybody else, if you do want to contribute or ask anything of our presenters, you can do that in the Q&A chat, and I'd be more than happy to put that to Martin or to Robert. But in the meantime, I've got another one for you, Martin. You have talked a lot about the importance of growing the UK flag. Why is it important, but why is it important specifically in relation to jobs and training and also our national security?
The UK flag allows for more effective and direct influence and control from the UK government in terms of vessel operations. So when we're talking of national security, it's quite apt that we think back to sort of 42 years ago with the Falklands War, where there are vessels ships taken up from trade. Stuffed is the so-called acronym regarding to that. And there are a number of vessels in that conflict that were ships taken up from trade, requisitioned effectively by the UK government, where that is allowable under certain conditions under the UK ship register. So it just means there's a broader base of support should the nation need it in times of crisis, in times of emergency. In terms of job security, it allows for more effective and direct regulation of the terms and conditions that seafarer employment is governed by. There are chunks of the Merchant Shipping Act which cover seafarer employment, and there are chunks of a myriad of other legislation where it is mentioned, where it is covered, and where it is excluded. So it is needing to be able to actually put these things together in one sort of key area where we're talking about reform to the Merchant Shipping Act that will then support in terms of reform to the UK ship register, grow the UK ship register, allow for better employment protections for seafarers that will be working on it. And in terms of a final point as well in UK domestic shipping, it allows for more effective control and utilisation, exploration and initialisation of cabotage, protecting UK domestic supply industry from actors elsewhere that undermine a solid UK domestic base. And it can be utilised further to support wider economic benefits through perhaps exploring the need for a certain proportion of vessel construction to be UK linked, where we can look at the steel, the materials, the equipment that goes on board, needing to have a link to generate a net benefit for elsewhere in the UK economy, and really use it as a tool for leverage and for gains across the UK and across the UK's industrial heritage and economy.
Thank you. Well, I can see, Martin, that there's no more questions coming in. Colleagues, this is your final call for questions. Otherwise, we will let you go to your lunches. I'll just pause here for a minute to see if anybody else would like to give a question. Great. Well, in which case, thank you very much, Martin and Robert, for your presentations today. If anybody on the call do have any colleagues who you think would benefit from watching this webinar, or in fact part one of the webinar as well, please do send them over to our YouTube channel where they can watch on demand. You can also like and you can subscribe to that channel, and that will make sure that you don't miss any of our webinars or any of our other content in future. And don't forget, if you're not in membership, you're not protected. So do speak to colleagues about the benefit of membership, because we are truly stronger together. Thank you, everybody, and goodbye.